So again, welcome to the Decolonizing Together Symposium, and we will begin our symposium with a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to pass this on to Grace Point.
Almost forgot the mute button. Asiyem Nisieya Hai Tapka Teshwalap Quithi Alap Quithmi Itana Lalam Itana Tamos to Mathguim Masteo and to Clacy Talitanak Mathguim Ait Tanish Qualo and Quincy Quatsnala Nestle Quans Osat all Amit Zap Quatwheelam. I'd like to just thank you all for coming here to this building, this Zoom symposium, and acknowledge that we are on the land of, I am on the land of Musqueam people, and acknowledge that we share territory with Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh. And my name is Grace, and I'm from Musqueam.
Sorry.
And I'm happy to see you all, and so welcome.
Thank you, Grace, for that lovely welcome. So good evening, everyone, once again, and welcome to the Decolonizing Together Symposium. I'm so happy that you're all joining us today, and that too on a Friday evening. Also, please remember to take advantage of the Skip the Dishes cards that you've all received. I would like to take a moment and thank the organizing team. I'd like to thank Dr. Shannon Letty, the project lead, Dr. Beseva Opini, and our wonderful team of graduate assistants, Kieran Ford, Brittany Townrow, Natasha Monstrell, and Grace Point. We're also grateful to Shirk for funding this project. I hope this evening inspires you to continue conversations about equity, diversity, inclusion, and education, including how we can support equity-deserving groups and how we can move forward to ensure the inclusion of their perspectives and experiences, which have previously been absent in teacher education. So I look forward to your comments at the end of this session. And I'm now going to pass this on to Dr. Beseva Opini, who will introduce our two amazing speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Surita Changiani, for that introductory welcome to the group. I want to really promise you that you are going to be in for a wonderful treat from our two amazing speakers. So I'll introduce the first speaker, and then when the time comes, I'll introduce the second speaker. My apologies. So I will start. I want to introduce the first guest speaker. And the guest speaker is Dr. Arlo Kempf, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Curriculum, Teaching and Learning at OIC, University of Toronto. His research interests are in anti-racism and anti-racism education in K-12, teacher education, critical whiteness, and white supremacy, and education, teachers' work, and professional lives in critical perspectives, as well as neoliberal education. Dr. Kempf has published in various leading journals, and his sixth book, edited with Dr. Sandra Stiles, is coming from the University of Alberta, so look out for it. He's the editor of Curriculum Inquiry and the Curriculum and Inquiry Journal. I have known Arlo for quite a few years, and I have to say he's one of the critical scholars you do not want to miss when it comes to doing a critical examination of education and ways we ought to be thinking about working with each other, working with the students, and mentoring our future educators. So the floor is yours, Arlo. We look forward to the conversations. Thank you.
I feel especially honored to have gotten introduced twice due to the muting error, though. So Beseva, thank you so much. Let me share my screen, and then I can kind of get rolling here. All right. So I'm really happy to be here. I want to begin by just sort of situating a few different things. So my name is Arlo, as Beseva mentioned, and I'm coming to you from OISE from UT in Toronto. The title of my talk is Race, Whiteness, and Teacher Education. And I'm going to assume that everyone can hear me. And if there's a problem, please shout it out. I'm not going to be looking at chat while I'm talking. So please just jump in. I won't be offended if an interruption happens at all. I want to begin with some what I think to be important acknowledgements, as well as some sort of locations, if you will. So I want to begin by thanking the organizers. I really appreciate the invitation to be here, Vaseba. Thank you for having me. We have known each other, many, many years. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Shannon, as well, for having me. Thank you to everybody organizing. I want to thank the folks who are sort of behind the scenes. I had a chance to meet a couple of you previously. Thanks for making this all happen. And to everyone who's joined on a Friday afternoon. It's Friday evening for me here in Toronto. I'm in a different territory than you. And I want to talk about that location for a sec too. So I'm coming from Williams Treaty Territory, Toronto Treaty Territory, Toronto Purchase Territory, Treaty 13 Territory. I'm coming from stolen lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas, of the Credit, and the Huron-Wendat as well. And I think talking about territories in a literal sense is important. And I also think we can talk about territories a little bit in terms of metaphorical territories and territories of teacher education. And the conversation that I feel I'm, wanting to have a part of tonight and comment on. And when I think about the work that I've done in schools over the last number of years, and I'll introduce myself further in a moment, I see myself as being in the same territory. And I see conversations around public teacher education, normal schools going back 100 years, as being in the same territory as the sadistic, murderous, fascist colonial oppression of residential schools. I see this territory as being one that is related. So I can't help but think that the conversation we're having is, life and death in many cases, going back and going forward, and that, the legacies of residential schooling are with us in today's rates of, who's in teaching, who's considered successful in schooling, who's allowed, who's stopped, who has motility, who doesn't. And I'll say more about these things. So these are sort of the commitments of the presentation as I move forward tonight. So I mentioned that the title of the talk is Race, Whiteness, and Teacher Education, and it's going to be roughly divided into just adjusting some formatting here, excuse me, roughly divided into about 5 parts. The first is framing whiteness, sort of situating whiteness. The second is going to be teacher ed as a site for race work. The third, pedagogies of discomfort within teacher preparation programs. The fourth, anti-racism commitments and their limitations in teacher prep. And the fifth, toward the foundations of anti-racism work in teacher preparation. So hopefully that sort of holds together. I want to situate my perspective a little bit here. I'm coming to you as a former teacher. I was a high school teacher in Toronto for 7 years. I've been involved with teacher education for over a decade now. I have just finished a stint. I was director of OISE's Master of Teaching program for 6 years and have been involved in research projects as lead and as an assistant and as a student and different projects around race and teaching for a long time. I've done all these things in a particular body with particular frames, and a lot of that's involved, first off, being an uninvited guest and settler on those stolen lands that I talked about, and also being a white person and being perceived in particular ways, being in schools and everything from, going to visit teacher candidates in the field and the way I get treated as I walk into the office to really unwarranted authority sometimes I'm offered, and down to the sort of myriad ways in which I'm anticipated, my whiteness is anticipated, and in which I can anticipate the world anticipating my whiteness. So my perspective sort of is necessarily wrapped up in what I can and can't see, what I can and can't offer, and the ways in which there are limitations and possibilities to what I'm bringing to this. So what I'm going to walk through in the next number of slides in a few minutes is really a look at research that I've conducted in the teacher education program at the University of Toronto over a number of years with a few other folks, but also, and probably to a greater extent, a number of other pieces of scholarship from teacher ed scholars in Canada and the US. And these are sort of braided together to sort of offer what I have tonight. So that's how I kind of situate my perspective. And I want to begin with, how I sort of talk about myself in terms of this question of situating whiteness, which was part 1 that I mentioned previously. So to my mind, when we think about, meaning and mattering and whiteness, we can't look past the fact that we can trace some very specific European imperialist trends: domination, colonization, enslavement, and racial capitalism, and that these phenomena very specifically construct the moment we're in now. You can see these histories as having constructed whiteness as a standard from which deviation is figured as highly unacceptable. And we see this in teacher ed, and we see it as a standard that seeks to reproduce itself, and teacher ed being a place where that reproduction happens. Rita Coley talks about the standard of whiteness leaving many teacher candidates of color feeling invisible, silenced, isolated. And against that, we do know about, changing populations. We know within the Canadian context that racialized and Indigenous folks represent growing segments of the population, yet remain underrepresented in universities and in teacher ed programs. Henry et al., who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, offer those stats there. So what that means then is, if we look at those numbers, it means there's overrepresentation, right? We have imbalanced proportions, even with increasing numbers of Indigenous teacher candidates within TPPs or teacher preparation programs. There's not been a significant increase in the percentage of Indigenous teachers. Scholarship in and around teacher education within teacher prep contexts of varied kinds, much of it is practice done by and for white folks, and most teacher candidates and teacher educators are white folks. This cuts across questions of gender as well, and this is likely no surprise. White women remain highly overrepresented in teacher education. In fact, the idea of white women being so overrepresented is so normalized that you probably already all knew that. And those of you who've been around this field for a while know this is a thing that's been said about schooling for 20, 25, 50 years without much shifting. So we have to think about why, racial and gender mismatching matters. Why do we care about these things? We know that racial matching between students and teachers can be beneficial in terms of scholastic success, and some research suggests well-being. And such a match they can be particularly significant among Black students, particularly Black students who identify as boys or men. And I mean, we think about racial mismatching. We tend to sometimes overlook the fact that there's a whole bunch of racial matching happening all the time. White kids have been racially matched throughout Canadian public schooling history fairly consistently, and been the recipients of those benefits that are pointed out in the literature that those who are mismatched don't necessarily get. So we can think about the fact that although we might be tempted to think this is a race to get particular people into the profession, and we should, and I think targets matter. We do still have to pay attention to the fact that it's not just about increasing diversity, it's about what those conversations are. How do we think deeply about the dispositions that are brought into teaching? How do we think deeply about the training pieces? And how do we think holistically about all those sort of concepts happening all at the same time? And I think in broader perspective, we can, see that teaching has done this in different ways for a long time. The notion of a socially dominant group pervading the teaching profession is internationally the case. Teachers tend to belong to socially dominant groups. We get that from Kutry and Whiting. And while the teaching force is increasingly homogenous, the student body they teach is increasingly heterogeneous. So this divide and the shifts in these numbers, Philip and Benin, O'Brien, lots of folks have pointed this out as being a really key place to pay attention. And we can think of that overrepresentation of white folks as a way that whiteness emerges and is situated there. So we can also pay attention to sort of, what does it look like to think about how whiteness is situated or situating? And we can think about common trends. We can think about things that emerge from the context that I described previously. So we can think about, white victimhood, a key component of the reproduction of the standard of whiteness in schooling. Some white students understand the questioning of their contributions to classroom discussions of race as an attack on their own racial identity, and may not question the beliefs that underlie their contributions. I've had this experience numerous times, and when reading about this in research, it just jumped off the page for me. We might see often the case that white students may demand to have their voices and opinions heard in a process which may silence or marginalize or injure, regardless of how problematic or troubling what they're saying is. We might injure racialized students who are in that same space. We can see this as an act that serves the reproduction of whiteness. And then really, how do these conversations end, and what does it mean when they end? That's disproportionate too. When conversations become too tense, some white students may withdraw from a conversation. a luxury that's not afforded to many students of color for whom addressing and naming race and inequity may be a matter of discursive survival. So some little framing on whiteness here, but then let's talk about the notion of teacher preparation sites as relevant and important. And I think going back, and I'm sure many of you know lots about this who've joined this evening, it's, I think key to point out that recognizing racism as a situated concept, one that operates in specific contexts. Teacher education is one such context. And so thinking about this space that we're in, that so many of us are in, this odd little space in the world that most people don't pay a lot of attention to, is this central site of production and reproduction of race and racism and white supremacy in many cases. And we know this goes back, right? We can look at 100 years. While we haven't had race as a focus within the curriculum in a lot of teacher education programs for more than the past generation or so. We can look back over a century, various different kinds of scholarship recognizing that the values around diversity that get communicated and reproduced in teacher education are central and have implications society-wide. So we're in a very important space when we have these conversations. It might seem rarefied in the sense that a lot of people don't pay attention to it, but its impact, as all of us know, is hugely significant. So what are some of the things we see from some of the research that's been done on this? Against the backdrop of whiteness and harmful attitudes and approaches described here, these programs emerge as opportune, important environments to instill values and impart practices that can move teachers to operate in anti-racist ways, in the anti-racist ways for which the research calls. Unfortunately, we see that these conversations on race and racism and white supremacy aren't happening as often as they should. And Coley and others point out that when they do, they can often be superficial with a focus on a toolkit, with a focus on getting, the sort of majority of students who tend to be white comfortable to a certain degree with using a certain kind of tool, but not really paying attention to how to prepare teacher candidates of color, as well as how to look at the sort of deeper underpinnings of systemic, institutional, and structural racism. So recognizing that teachers are positioned, no matter what, as key agents of social production or reproduction, whether that's maintaining the status quo or being transformative change makers, recognizing that happens regardless, the call to prepare people to work effectively as anti-racist, custodians of the future becomes so important. When we fail to do that, we see teachers entering the workforce without the knowledge they need, sort of bumbling through anti-racism work, never feeling quite confident enough to do it. I've been in teacher education for 15 years, and I remember when I was first in teaching and hearing this thing, well, I'm thinking, Indigenous education is important, but I don't know what to do. I heard that 20 years ago when I was a classroom teacher, and I hear it today with colleagues sometimes talking about this idea. And when we see that kind of inability to move forward, produced and reproduced over essentially a generation, it speaks to the fact that this is bigger, and we need bigger responses. So we can think about, what can we start to do, and far from saying that our prep programs should be prescriptive, the research, Grundhoff et al., as well as some of the other people I've talked about, have found that building skills and knowledge so that teachers can go on to make informed professional decisions can reap way better results. So we can think about empathic practices of engaging race. We have great work by Warren and others on empathy and culturally responsive pedagogy. So some of you are probably familiar with culturally responsive PED and Django Paris's work on culturally sustaining PED. And the idea that teacher candidates can't be taught to respond to every situation. They can't be. I used to have when I was doing a lot of teacher ed classroom work, I would always talk about, if a robot can do it, then it's not that important for teaching. And it's not that we figure out what to do in every single situation, but that dispositions get built, empathic skills get built that allow for reflexive, thoughtful, anti-racist interaction over time to meaningfully and actively resist normative whiteness. And that requires what Grundhoff et al. Talk about as sort of a diversity of opportunities to engage race, the need to have multiple, places and spaces to learn and zero in on all aspects of the program, including the practicum, which is so key, as important opportunities to operationalize equity-focused approaches. So I mentioned the practicum. Let's jump to the practicum, and I titled this slide "The Choppy and Distant Waters of the Practicum." Doing 5 years of data collection on teacher experiences in one of Canada's largest teacher ed program specifically looking to understand experiences of racism, experiences of mobilized white supremacy in schooling. And what we found doing that work was year after year that the practicum was the place where, the most sort of discursive violence was happening around race. And it was also the place where we had the sort of least reach as leaders of a teacher education program. We couldn't reach into the program, into the practica environment to have important conversations and impact that space. And so we know that, the learning of teachers in their first 2 years of teaching, as well as in their practica, sort of sets their charts their path for a lot of their lifelong practice as teachers. And that's why I say this idea, and you've heard the phrase, culture beats training 10 days out of 10. And what they get in that sort of, cultural, what would you say, onboarding in those spaces is so key. And Coley and Bennett and others have talked about, you may even have a really beautiful program going on, but they go out into the practicum and things happen. And what those things look like can be various, right? I mean, we can think about the perils and politics of professionalism, right? Once in the practicum environment, teacher candidates are confronted with, the perceived neutrality of the notion of professionalism. Marome, writing in 2018, talks about professionalism as coded and it really as sort of performing as if it's race neutral and as if it doesn't intersect with linguistic and cultural performance or with class. And teacher candidates, describe being asked by their associate teachers to dress or speak more professionally. And the subtext of those requests, of course, is to, erase visible or audible aspects of candidates' racial or ethnic identity. So candidates may or may not acquiesce if they have the means or the inclination to do so, but also have to avoid being, making targets out of themselves. And this can be described early on as sort of learning how to play the game. And I've been in teacher education contexts where that's actually taught. It's like, swallow this thing about you. You got to learn how to play the game, and that's what counts. And what gets invisibilized is not only the fact that that is a racially marked sort of site of production, but what gets invisibilized is aspects of who people are, right? And in that, the scars and injuries that occur through that sort of silencing, if you will. And this isn't new either. We look at Danny Solorzano's work from 2007, and going back even then, 15 years, he identified these cultural deficit ideologies that teacher candidates found when they entered the field oftentimes. And the first was the mismatch between racialized and indigenous populations' cultural values and dominant schooling values. And the second was the teacher candidates' stories of hearing from their ATs, their associate teachers in the classroom, sort of racialized justifications for so-called underperformance of racialized students. So, accounting for gaps in outcomes by sort of blaming students and almost, specifically blaming that cultural piece. And that takes on all kinds of things about how we, associate caring about school with some cultures and not others. So up against this, we're stuck with the context of the programs we're in, and some of us have fulsome partnerships of various kinds, and there's opportunities there, as I'm sure many people on this meeting know better than I do. But within the program, there's some work we can do, I think, to do some, recognizing. I think that's an important step. And as I say, I'm sure, many folks are far down this road, and I have a lot to learn from a lot of people here, no doubt. But we can think about, what I call first generation race consciousness, and within the context of teacher preparation programs, which tend to have folks whose families have been in teaching, which tend to be overly white and female, as we've said, which tend to be pretty, reproductive oftentimes of sort of dominant ideas. Think about the idea that, being confronted with power, being confronted with associated histories of oppression connected to one's positionality, so whiteness in particular, this may be a first for some students, and it may be the first time anyone in their family has come in contact with these ideas in a way that was sort of, compulsory, if you will. And in that, and in other, tense, challenging moments, can come a transformative discomfort. I think we're all familiar with the idea that discomfort can be productive, and can we think about it as being transformative? Now, not to be confused with a lack of safety or with danger, but discomfort can be transformative, but only if teacher educators have the capacity and the support to do the emotional labor required of these, transformations, and only if teacher educators themselves feel comfortable in facilitating those discussions, and if they want to. Everybody on this call is interested in these ideas. which means that there's a whole bunch of people who aren't on the call, and not just people who are busy, but folks who maybe aren't interested in these ideas. And so there has to be that inclination among the person doing the work to begin with. And we know, Bowler and Zembalis tell us that safety is defined by those in power in classrooms, and that means the teachers or the professors, and that conditions of power and privilege always operate in classrooms, contributing to diminished safety for some. So paying attention to this is key, and that can result in seemingly rival needs. So Davis and Stain talk about the way in which racialized students' need for safety, for example, in conversations that may debate their very humanity around immigration or around student achievement or whatever it might be incompatible with that of privileged students who may have a desire to not be challenged. So one thing we can do is to think about just paying attention to these phenomena, recognizing those, saying that just happened, this just happened, and then from there, thinking about how we can move forward from there. But before we get into that, how do we move forward? I want to, I guess, go one level deeper in what the literature talks about, and certainly my own experiences illustrate around these further challenges about us as teacher educators in these spaces, right? So you can think about the impact student evaluations can have on the frequent precarity of teacher educator employment. So that's an awful sentence, if I'm being frank. What I should have said there, what I'm really talking about there, is the way that so few people have permanent gigs in teacher education programs that skews disproportionately high in terms of the level of precarity in a lot of different schools in the States and Canada, which means you're on the hook, which means those evals matter, who you know matters, how you get along matters. And it means that doing that work becomes all the more risky when to sort of rock that boat is to risk pissing off someone who's going to create an evaluation, which is your chair is going to see, and which really might make a difference, particularly if you don't feel that supported to begin with. And that's to say nothing of the fact that if you have my race and my gender, I'm way more likely to get a fair shake or a positive shake on a student evaluation than if I were a woman of color. And we know this from tons of work, a lot of it coming out of Canada. We can also think about the challenge of, affecting discomfort and why this is difficult when a teacher educator's personal politics or lived experience makes dialogues of discomfort difficult to navigate. We all bring our things. And we can think about the ongoing labor of supporting discomforted students, and as well supporting students. I mean, I've stopped promising my students that my classroom is a safe space. I don't think university is a safe space, particularly for trans students and students of color. I've stopped saying that. I've said I will work toward it. And you have my promise, my heartfelt promise that I'm going to work toward it. But I no longer promise it. I no longer talk about this being, it's going to be uncomfortable, but it's going to be safe. It's not. That's not something we can really say and do anti-racist work at the same time. So the labor, it's just extra work to do that. And the more precarious one is, the more likely they are to be busier in many cases. And when you see that sort of relationship between precarity and taking risks and what it takes to do all this work, it's harder and it's more dangerous. So of course, we see it challenging there. We see it's a challenge to make that happen. So I guess we have to table those things in a sense because, I'll talk about institutional commitments in a moment, but, that doesn't mean that in the meantime, we're not sort of in the muck. And when I say we, I recognize it as a white guy with a job. I don't know if I'm part of the we I'm talking about here. So I'll just put that out really, really quickly. But if we think about, the need to continue addressing that resistance of white folks, Henriette and I'll talk about, the single largest stumbling block to engaging in effective anti-racist work is the resistance of white folks. So there needs to be some centering there. Indeed, calling attention to systemic issues can be viewed as anti-social and as anti-team, as Coley frames it, and that is the stuff. So then that takes us to this question of the strengthening of the quality and breadth of our institutional commitments. So for anybody who has, the authority to be involved in hiring, or anyone who's reviewing student evaluations, are we taking the time to think through these things? Are we taking the time to think about risk and time? Are we building in, wellness lunches for people where they can come and they can work out or exercise or eat with someone else over a screen with their colleagues at work, but not taking the time to say, you know what, race is important to us as a program, and you do race work, so we're going to give you extra time and remunerate it in this way? Are we thinking about, whether it's the way decisions are made, the way hiring happens? Are we thinking about the large scale and commonplace commitments of a program? Going back 20 years, Jacobs and High read about this. They said the less an institution as a whole deals with race issues, the more individual lecturers on race courses will be expected to solve wider problems. Minority lecturers and race courses will continue to be seen as emblematic, and the many individual initiatives which do occur will be less effective. That's 20 years old, and we might change a little bit of the nomenclature there, but the point stands pretty tall 20 years later. I don't know about folks on this call, but for me, I've spent almost all my teaching, in teacher ed at least, teaching the lonely courses, the standalone courses, the lonely life of the social foundations course. That's where I spent most of my time. These standalone courses, often with standalone instructors, right? The role of the standalone equity course or the standalone Indigenous ed course and their instructors in the program, they have to have some of the broadest shoulders. And I'm sure all the instructors of all the courses feel that way about their courses, but we're here to talk about race. And in the case of these equity courses or the Indigenous ed courses, those shoulders need to be so wide for a few reasons. It's not just the risk I was talking about previously and the level of precarity, but we get into this even more. So instructors of these courses are more likely to be Indigenous, more likely to be racialized, more likely to identify as women. And in these contexts, you have that extra precarity, and then you have the riskiness of the course, and then you have the work of Dwayne Donald and Fiona Purton and Sandra Stiers and I at U of T have been working on this as well. The experiences of Indigenous faculty, often precarious, teaching the mandatory Indigenous ed courses, which we see in more and more schools across the country, teacher ed programs, the way in which that can be injurious, not just in the ways you talked about, in terms of actually experiencing that discursive violence in the course, which comes from these courses being islands. It comes from this being the place where this gets talked about and everywhere else being the place, well, that's where education happens, and this is the equity piece. And as much as we probably don't tend to think that this is where education is now, we see in recent research about, progressive schools across the country that we see these kinds of phenomena happening. And similarly, we see the perseverance, the resilience of these approaches: colorblindness, multiculturalism, and deficit-informed expectations. I would say these go along with some of the things we've been talking about. So we can think about, colorblindness as an orientation that encourages teachers and teacher candidates to treat all pupils the same, irrespective of race. We can think of this as actively ignoring race. Coley talks about this as actively ignoring race in the hope, that racism will disappear. However, situated within a system that privileges certain behaviors over others and punishes others and disadvantages others, this is impossible, right? Attempts at which necessarily leave some students behind and necessarily promote others. So this, colorblind approach ignores the underlying problems that construct racism in the first place. Daniel points out that there's a stark difference between not seeing race and not experiencing the negative impacts of racialized structures and power. My supervisor, when I was a doctoral student a few years ago, George Day, he used to say, well, when we claim we don't see race, it's usually our own race that we're not seeing. And we could think about this and say, well, most of us are, not colorblind. We say, I don't ascribe to that. It's not something that I think describes how I teach or the philosophy of my teaching. But I think the way to get at whether or not that's true, and the way I would test myself on this, is twofold. Like, A, am I ready to talk about the differences by race and how I'm going to work with students? Am I willing to say, this student is white and therefore I'm going to treat them and work with them and serve them in this way, but I'm consciously going to serve a student of another race in a different way? And similarly, as teacher educators, are we ready to say to our teacher candidates, look, you need to differentiate by race. You need to see race and it needs to be reflected in your practice. So it's not just colorblindness of whether or not you see race, it's whether or not you're willing to teach around, through, and conscious of race, and name it in teaching, and think about practices that are race. So in that sense, with that broader definition of it, colorblindness catches a lot more people in its net than it might if we just treat it as, do you see, do you notice, or note race? And multiculturalism is sort of a shroud, I would say, pulled over racism. Daniel talks about it, and Marome is attacking a problem. It's sort of, without considering or attacking the problems, it adds to a kind of colorblindness and can sort of push those things below the surface. O'Brien, in his 2009 work, talks about discourses of multiculturalism that can be well-intentioned, but often result in essentialized and exoticized views, which do little to advance, the futures of marginalized communities. And then finally, we're learning more and more about deficit-informed expectations. And this is not just thinking about in K-12 having low expectations. of certain students based on race, but it's also looking at who do we automatically have high expectations of, and to sort of, think about our own practices and think about, honestly, when we're having conversations, are there certain topics where we're less likely to challenge a student and give wise criticism and do the reading needed to be there for that person, push that person, have the hard conversation. And if we can't, say that that never happens, then we may, in fact, and this has been the case for me, I'll admit, mean that we are working with deficit-informed expectations. It might be unconscious. In fact, for folks in a conversation like this, it's probably mostly unconscious. But to actually look at that and to do, when I do a lot of work on bias and other things, and to actually do an inventory on our own grading and our own interactions and our own ways in which we offer feedback that really challenges students, to do a look at who do we spend the most time challenging in productive ways, to do a race inventory of that would suggest that probably more of us than we think often have deficit-informed expectations. You may hear my dog barking. I apologize for that. So from here, I think we can think about, moving toward this sort of foundations of anti-racism work in teacher preparation. And I think for me, I want to go to critical race on this. From conscious and unconscious reproduction of colonial whiteness in teacher education to critical race on work, or critical work on race. I'm sorry, I'm distracted by my dog. I think critical race theory has a lot to offer. And many of you are probably familiar with a lot of the controversy that's happening right now in the US in terms of critical race theory. And I think we do well to stick to what critical race theory is according to critical race theorists, rather than the 18 attorneys, state attorneys general, who have petitioned the government to ban funding of critical race projects there. So I won't get into that. But as many of you probably know, CRT emerges from critical legal studies, scholars like Derek Bell and Higginbottom and others. And they focus on not only pushing past the presumed neutrality of our systems, legal systems, education systems, but also push us to pay attention to systemic structural sort of manifestations of race, as well as look at the lived experiences of folks who experience marginalization based on race. So I talked about Danny Solorzano previously and Rita Coley, and in work that sort of brings together their take on CRT and teacher education, we can identify 5 tenets or 5 principles here, which we could call these sort of 5 foundations of anti-racism work in teacher preparation. And the first of these is naming race, racism, and white supremacy, and being prepared to put them at the center of our work. This is huge. The second is challenging dominant and or monolithic views. The third is fostering a commitment to social justice. The fourth is centering the value of stories and counter stories of racialized people. And the fifth is taking a multidisciplinary scholarly research approach. So I just walked through all of these. I'm just going to go back because I wanted you to see them all. I should have put them all on one slide for you. But when we get back to this naming race, this first one, this sounds really common sense, but anyone who's done race work knows when you start to try to pay attention to race, name it, put it at the center, say this is going to be at the table. Very quickly, people often want to put other stuff on the table. And the more full that table gets, sometimes race tends to get pushed off that table. So it's not to say that there isn't space for intersectionality. In fact, good anti-racist work relies upon it. That's also a tenet of CRT. But that instead, without paying attention to this specifically, at least for a moment in some of this work, we can't get this work done. We can't get to these places we need to get to. Challenging dominant and monolithic views. This is key. And although we might, I know for me, I've made the mistake of thinking, well, I do intro to Freire and I talk about critical ped and I talk about the banking model. I'm challenging the dominant view. Am I? Maybe, sometimes. But I think to really get at that is to sort of pay attention, like to see dominant views as associated with dominant social groups around whiteness, to see, monolithic views as those that incorrectly lump disparate experiences together. For example, assuming that all experiences of BIPOC folks are the same, something that Robson talks about. In terms of fostering a commitment to social justice, this is a challenging piece because this gets at all the things we've been talking about so far. It gets at the idea that eradicating, racism, white supremacy in these spaces, that impulse needs to be incorporated directly into the theoretical frame of the entire program. It's not just in certain courses, it's in all courses, it's in the way courses are mapped. It's in the hiring, it's in the decision making, it's in the tone, it's in the way in which race and gender and these other pieces we've talked about get seen and spoken about and named, which means that, you know, you can't expect to have, you know, I don't know, a senior member of a team whose every fourth word out of their mouth is some kind of a racial microaggression, and then at the same time have some good equity work happening over here and hope that, yeah, the program's going to be fine. It takes that top to bottom cleaning out the closet piece to get at this stuff, to make it work. And that's as I'm sure anyone on the call knows, that's a really tall order. The lived experiences piece I mentioned earlier, centering the value of stories and counter stories of racialized folks, and understanding that the sort of mainstream positivist empiricism takes a long time to catch up with what a lot of folks who experience racism on a daily basis understand as written on the body, understand as written on the brain. So the focus on those lived experiences is so important, the value of those counter stories. And then finally, taking a multidisciplinary scholarly research approach. We can't allow teachers to sort of not understand their role as public intellectuals. If teachers don't understand their public intellectuals, I don't think we can expect them to do anti-racism work. So seeing teaching as research, and there's lots of good work on this, I'm sure people know more about this than I do, but we just can't see race and racism in isolation. And teacher ed work must contribute to, I think, growing scholarship aimed at understanding race and racism within the context of teacher prep, but also within education more broadly and societally beyond that. So I'm just about to wrap up. I would add to the work of Solorzano and Coley 3 additional propositions, which I come out of literature and out of my own work. And so they'll give us sort of eight, what would you say, propositions in total. And the first is that I think we need to always come back, and CRT tells us, as to a systemic and institutional approach that, you know, rather than an individual one. And this is a shift that Coley and others have talked about, and it's crucial to the success of race work. If we keep locating it at the level of the individual, if we're getting, you know, if things keep bubbling up and we never look at it systematically, we're not really looking at it. And the limits of intentionality, right? O'Brien, 2009, notes that intentionality is not a prerequisite to the instantiation and reproduction of institutionalized racism. However, it will take intentional effort on the behalf of both individuals and institutions to dismantle racism. So this is not just intent is not impact. That's true. We talk about intent is not impact. That's an important thing. It's not what you meant to do. It's what the impact of what you did was. But as O'Brien and others have pointed out, intent matters to the degree to which, if we're not trying to do this work, if we're not trying to do anti-racist work, it ain't going to happen. So intent does matter, and an impact is the next part of that. And then resisting white normativity explicitly. Coley again contends that teacher prep programs that do not explicitly resist racism are complicit in its reproduction. In fact, she writes that it's impossible without the firm commitment of teacher education programs to acknowledge and then to actively decenter whiteness without, you know, specifically resisting white normativity. And so that's, I think, if we can add that to those 5 tenets, and I will in just a moment. But I talked about toolboxes previously, and one of the best toolboxes I've ever seen, one of my colleagues in the Master of Teaching program, Andrew Campbell, who goes by Dr. ABC, he's got a collection of videos that he puts out for MT, Master of Teaching teacher candidates when they go out to practicum. And there's about 13 of these tips. And it's you'll rarely find a finer toolbox. And don't worry about writing down that address. I'll make it simpler in a moment. But if you were to go to his page, his YouTube page, you would find this, you know, set of videos, and they're bright, they're thoughtful, they're not focused on just the individual. They do all the things. They're really, you know, applied to someone who's in teacher education, has been on the ground and gets it. And my push is that I think all of us probably would be happy to send these out to our students, happy to receive this if we are students. But, you know, the challenge is to go from having these and going, oh, great tools, nice toolbox, to putting those tools into an engaged perspective, an engagement with these broader imperatives of placing race at the center, challenging dominant views, fostering commitment to social justice, centering the values of stories, taking a multidisciplinary approach, systemic and institutional approach, as I said, limits of intentionality, and resisting normativity explicitly. So my push is to say, we all have these, probably, I have a thumb drive. Many of you probably do. It's now an online drive, but for years I had a drive and it was all these amazing resources. And I was so excited, and we could first sort of save all these and share them with students, and encourage students to put these together. But my question is like, what is the system that's running them? What are they in service of? It's not enough to have those tools. How do we be guided by these other pieces? And I suggest that in response to all the sort of phenomena I've talked about, that what we need to be doing here is not just finding the tools and the tips, but putting the tools and the tips into these conversations, putting them into these broader perspectives. So this portion of the session is going to be recorded, so I won't linger, but I think it's really important. I've cited a bunch of people. These are all the people I've cited. If you're interested in these, you can go and find the video once it's published and pause and take these down. But this is a lot of the important work. So I won't linger on that for much longer, and I'll leave you with that proposition about putting those things in, and also leave you with how to find Dr. ABC's amazing videos there. So there's the full IRL, but you can also just search Dr. ABC MT tips. I did that earlier. It takes you right to it. So I'm not exactly sure how I did in terms of time, but I am really glad you've taken the time to be with me in conversation. And I'm so grateful that we have another presenter. When Batseba promised an amazing evening, I think she was talking about part 2. Hopefully my part 1 was okay. And I think the thrill is going to be our conversation later on. So I'll stop my screen share, and I'll turn over the rest of the evening to everybody else. And thank you so much for listening tonight.
Dr. Kempf, thank you so much for an incredibly insightful presentation, and for your personal vulnerability and critical self-reflexivity. Modeling that is such an important part of what we hope to get across in this evening's presentation. So you've really got us off to a great start.
I can agree with that, and thank you. I felt so grateful that I didn't have to follow you. And I know we're supposed to put our questions in chat, and I see one. So if we end up with extra time, Carolyn, a question for you would be, I'd love to hear more about anti-colonial conceptions of time, or like the anti-colonial side of that. Like that, I love the typology you developed, and I can't wait to read your thesis. I know it's not public yet, and we're sharing and not taking, but totally interested, particularly in the timepiece, because that's such a currency, right, in the education space. And I would love to see how that shapes out, you know, not even necessarily in writing, but conceptually, right? Like, what does that look like in that other space? But it was so beautiful to listen to you talk and share. And I feel so grateful to be in this space with you. So I'll be quiet now. I see some questions popping
in. Carolyn, did you want to answer that, respond to Arlo before we get on to the questions? There are a few here and they're building up, but I think we have time.
Well, yeah, it's a work in process for me. What I know about teaching and learning in spaces, when I had the opportunity to work in community at our community school, is that it's a process. It takes time. If we pull cedar from the tree, we can't use it right away. We have to let it sit. We have to let it rest, and then we have to process it. And it takes a long period of time to do this. So if we move away from this colonial thinking that this student has to know this, and this by here and then by here, but allowing them the process to learn in the places and spaces that they're in, of where they're going to direct it, I think that shifts that narrative of always pushing the time continuum. I'm not sure if I answered it totally, but maybe we can talk about it when I get it more mapped out. And I like Lisa's question. What exhausts you about settler educators that you would love to change? I think the thing of educators stepping aside from the work and not doing the work because they're too afraid. It really is exhausting. Just like if you were going into a school and you were a substitute and you had to teach math, you couldn't just say, well, I'm not going to teach math today. Well, I guess as a sub you could, but that I'm not going to teach math today. It's not an option because math's in our curriculum. We have to teach it. So why is it that you feel where's that place in you that feels it's okay to just step aside and not do this work? So I do get tired. I do get tired. But that doesn't there's also the flip side of that, of people who are doing amazing things with this work and taking up this work and wanting to be allies within this work, to do this work together. And that's what lifts me up within it.
Thanks, Caroline. I think the next question is from Selena, who says, being an Indigenous TC, she's struggling with assessments in the assessment course. And I know that to be the case, they're very colonial. So do you have any advice for our TCs on how to indigenize assessment?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And I haven't even gotten there, because assessment is an own entity on its own, and it's super duper colonial. How is it that I am going to be able to assess this little human being if I don't have all of the pieces? So for me, what I like to think about is, what is it that this little human wants to do? Right? And where's their learning at right now? Where do they want to learn? How are they learning and growing? And then giving them the opportunity to show me their learning, not what I'm dictating to them, but to show me their learning of what you've taken from this. And I have students that come into my courses at the university and they go, I'm sorry, so what is the assignment? The assignment is that you need to pick something that's interesting to you and that you're going to learn and grow from it. And then you're going to tell me how you learned and grow from it. We're never given that opportunity. So I think the assessment is its own entity, and I don't know enough about it, but I struggle with it too. And I know lots of others struggle with it. And I use a holistic framework. The holistic framework that guides me is Michelle Pidgeon's work. Maggie Kovach's work is beautiful with the holistic. So if you center your assessments around the holistic framework, it's totally going to help support you in your thinking around assessments.
Great response. I would add, as I was a former high school art teacher, similar to what you've done, and I always did parallel assessment too. So we have the same rubric for me and the student. The student gets to self-evaluate, and then I do it, and then we talk about it. So I think that's, but you're right. I mean, this is a challenging area to work through. We've got another question from Sheila, who is a secondary music cohort TC at UBC, and she wants you to talk through how it might look how this might look in a music classroom that is breaking down a music lesson plan in the same way.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so music education has the beautiful ability to be whatever it is that you want it to be. Music education is Western, colonial, European. Here's the notes, here's the rhythm, do this. You don't have to do that. That's not necessities. You don't have to get your students to sit at the desks or sit at the chairs and play the wind instrument and do this and do that. That's our Western colonial thinking of what music is. What other music is out there? What other interests? What other things can we bring into the classroom that is music related, but not necessarily sitting, playing Mozart and Baroque and all of those things? How are we going to bring in other types of music? How can we do music without our instruments? What are some things and ways that we can do that? We don't have to do this prescribed. And somebody who's doing some beautiful work in that is Shelley. Her last name's out of my head in this moment, but we're going to UVic in sometime in the next few months. Jody Prosnick and I are going to be presenting how to decolonize your music classroom at UVic. I'll post it on my Twitter feed when we know the date. Sorry, as I crash and burn at the end. But music's one of the easiest places that you can decolonize, because music for me, and I always told my students, I stood up at the front. I don't know if you know, but I have a degree, jazz piano. So, and music was my passion, is my passion. I would tell my students as they walk into the classroom, said, look, I am not expecting any of you to be massive musicians at the end of this. And I know that's really sad to say to you, but if you do become massive musicians, that's great. What I want for you is to love and appreciate music and what music can bring to you, and that we all have some kind of music abilities and ways to contribute to making music together as a community. So it was super easy with my frame of thinking to be able to bring my kids together that way. Did I answer?
I
I
think
think so. There were thank yous.
Okay, perfect.
Arlo, this direct the next question to you. Settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. If we're to teach multiple perspectives, we need to portray what the settler saw, as well as the Indigenous people's perspective of the strange white people who invaded their land. Is this not true?
If I'm understanding the question, and thank you for throwing it my way, and thanks, Pamela, for the question. I guess the idea here would be the idea of the implication that there's an absence of that settler perspective, or that there's an advocation here, or an advocacy for the elimination of that perspective. And I guess, I think, it's really hard to tell. I think what we have is sort of an echo of that perspective, of the settler perspective, that dominates the telling of, words like contact, which tend to be these like colonial sleeper cell bombs of ideas wrapped up in a thing, right? And I think dominant history tends to be a version of that. But yeah, I think, there's definitely like wampum teachings from Sandra Stiers and other folks who will take on notions of multiple perspectives at one time. And I think, for example, looking at texts of agreements. So if we're going to talk about what was seen, maybe texts of treaties where promises were made, even if we're going to talk about, how much consent does someone really have if a treaty is written in another language, all those things. But to really get into it, I think you could say, A, I think we've seen a lot of those perspectives in dominant history, and B, yeah, let's look for those. Let's look for what was actually said, what was seen, what sorts of agreements in treaty or otherwise indicate what was going on at the time, to try and get a good understanding of what everyone saw or what everyone thought was the agreement at one time. So I don't disagree that we need to understand as much as we can about all those pieces, but I don't think we have a sort of grand scarcity of understanding when it comes to settler perspectives on what that looked like. And I think for me, I'm 46 years old, and I can remember way more tellings growing up about this idea of contact, and go back to that idea, which is such a powerful idea, and the idea of like people seeing other people. There's that moment of seeing, who's doing the seeing and who's being seen, and then which narrative surrounds, thine eyes behold. Okay, whose eyes? And for me, I can't speak for everybody obviously, but I've heard a lot about what Indigenous folks seemed like. And in fact, when I'm taking, I still remember taking an OAC, so a grade 13, highest level course on, at the time it's called Native Studies in Ontario, and literally having to do drawings of teepees and canoes. And those are the same things that thine eyes behold. It was, so I think we have those perspectives, but I do think a deep unpacking of it. For example, looking at, what were the, let's go further. Let's unpack residential schooling and get into the curricula of residential schooling, and the way in which even what we might now call culturally responsive teaching was actually a colonial strategy for assimilation. And to go back to Carolyn's point, this is all about land. If we take away land, we're taking away the point. And so I think we see the perspective. I think we see what was seen. And I think we have that echoing through our systems and reverberating and still, acting. That was a long-winded way to respond, and I'm sure Carolyn would add to that. But let me say one more thing before I mute again. Back to the assessment question. I've done a lot of studying of large-scale assessment, and I do think there's something to be said around assessment is a brutality within education, but it's such a sharp point of the spear. It's where governments and universities alike, it's very hard to fire professors, but we've had a few fired for refusing to engage, for giving all A's, and then let's engage in learning. And it's a really wonderful opportunity for teachers at all levels to ask questions about why do we insist on these? So I think it's a source of brutality and a site of brutality, but it's also a site where we can do some really good opening up. And I'm not going to call that an act of decolonization, but I think there's some elements of anti-colonialism in there. And I think there's some destabilization, because it is the thing that you can't mess with as a teacher. It is the hard edge of the brutality of the bureaucracy. And that is, a lot of this stuff is metaphor. That stuff's not. You must. There are documents, there are legal documents. So I think there's a real power in critical work around assessment and in digging into it in ways that really shatter a lot of the, mainstream understandings of it. Anyway, enough from me.
Caroline, did you want to add anything to it, or do we go to the next question?
No, that was great. He did great.
Okay, good. Thank you. So the next question is, and either of you can take it up. How do we even begin to confront and dismantle the harm in how we label children in special education, and the impact this has on their identities and how they are seen and treated in the system? Interesting question.
Arlo, do you want to? So
After you.
so here's like when we're talking about that, it's giving us, we're again like putting students in categories and separating them out and saying that their differences are more than what they are as humans. So for me, inclusion means students are in the class participating the way that they can participate, and us honoring them in their wholeness within the classroom. And what drives me insane is that I think more elementary schools do this, but lesser in the high schools because they have those special places and special classrooms. We had a student that was in elementary school with my daughter and was in almost all of her classes growing up because she's really kind and compassionate, and they worked really well together. And then once they hit high school, he's now in the special education room, and he's not allowed to participate in other classrooms because he doesn't have the same physical abilities, but he's brilliant and he's smart. It's our job as educators to see that, and then how do we foster that in these spaces? Because if we're not including them in these spaces and places, then we're not going to be including them in the rest of society, and that's a part of being seen, and that's a part of being heard. So I think that how we dismantle that is that we honor people in all of these spaces, and we give them opportunities to be in these spaces, because the more that we push them out of the spaces, then that, like, for me, is soul crushing.
Is this, sorry, I lost the thread a little. Is this responding to Donna's question?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think there's the coloniality of body too, right? This whole imposition, and lots of people have talked about this in lots of different ways. And I think we see, the intersections of race work and madness studies and crypt studies and crypt theory. Like, I think there's a lot of places where, it speaks to the ways in which schools are really in the business of determining one's humanity, and thereby really determining who's not human and who's worthy of inhumane treatment. And I don't know that we get past that question of like, to go to something of inclusion. I mean, I think how do we to even think about inclusion around spec ed, I think, is to redesign the endeavor informed by neurodiversity, informed by what we consider to be now sort of the exalted and yet left alone and isolated understanding of disabled epistemologies. And until we're doing that, I don't know that we continue to just figure, oh, that's a better box, let's go there. And I think, to go back to why I think Carolyn's emphasis on time is so important. I mean, so much of this, as anybody who spent time in a classroom knows, is managerial, as are large scale assessments. So this is so much of this just managing bodies. And that's where we get to, like, what's the right box to put them in. And so until we undo some of those pieces, I think we continue to struggle. We might have more complementary boxes, but then we can look at who's put in spec ed, who's considered, for things like boys will be boys. Well, which boys we're talking, and how, and yeah, but it's a great question.
Thank you to you both. The next question is from Christine, and she says, my biggest struggle with the work is typically white male colleagues who have not done decolonial work and aim to center themselves in the work by being the loudest voice in the room while sitting on DEI or EDI truth and reconciliation committees. What is your suggestion to approach these types of individuals? And Carolyn immediately has covered her face. In a move that I can relate to. So well, whichever one of you wants to jump in with that, go right on ahead.
Arlo, I'll let you take it first and then I'll follow.
Yeah, it's only right that the white dude's gonna jump in on this one. I mean, can I curse yet? It's 9:44 here. It's like 3 hours earlier there, but am I allowed to curse yet? Am I allowed to have a drink and curse yet? I think it depends on the role. I really think it depends on the role. So for me, I talk about like white work and what white work is. So as a cis white male, I'm 6 feet tall. I'm really loud. I know how to take up space. I've been a struggling feminist since I was 15, and I try to pay attention to being in space. But I've also tried to pay attention to opportunities to engage kinds of masculinity in order to push back in certain moments, and in order to step in and have particular conversations. Seba and I talked about this years ago around like, what are conversations that are easier for me to have? I think discourses around microaggressions, although some people tend to throw them aside, I think they're really important. They can highlight stuff. You can pick language and say, nope, that was the thing. That's why we care about that. You just dismiss that. So I think it really depends on the role. And then you get back to the culture question and the structure question. What are the meetings in which that person is like self-proclaiming as cock of the walk in some nonsense way that everyone's kowtowing to? It's probably because of institutional power, or it's just habits. And so I think that's where the structure piece is. And that's where I think naming things like, do we have, and who are you? And I think white people, I'm not going to speak to everybody else's roles, but as a white person in a lot of these spaces, a lot of that's getting the hell out of the way. And also, I'm going to curse, calling bullshit when other people step in and they shouldn't. And being able to say, you know what, need folks to step back here. Hey, you and I have probably had our voices heard a lot. Why don't we step back here and do this? Like, so I think it really depends on where you're coming from. And I can speak to that as a white male, but part of that is because I have so much safety in knowing how to take up space. So I recognize the limitations of that offering. And now I'll be quiet.
Yeah. And I agree, right? So, and again, it comes down to that perspectives. For me, when I am in the space of running meetings like this, when this happens, because it happens all the time, is that Zoom's great because you can put people on mute. Just kidding. Sorry. Is controlling at the beginning of the meeting, just to say, look, so here we are, we're gathered here together. And what we're going to be doing in our work together is that we are going to be making sure that we honor and respect everybody that's in the room. And my work is guided by Werner Kirkness, is 4 R's, right? Respect, reciprocity. And then I clearly lay out what that means. Right. And when we go into these spaces, when we go into our breakout rooms, and when we're here in this space, it is listening to all of the voices that are in the room. And then maybe saying, can you hold on for a moment? I want to do this. But that's me. And it depends on what role I'm in. If I'm sitting in on a meeting and it's not my space, then my friend Sarah Davison takes pictures of my face to show my discomfort and unease in the situation. So it's like clear. It's clear as a bell if somebody says something that like, oh my God, did you just say that? So now it's an ongoing thing, and she's going to put together a Zoom window with all of my different faces. But being in those spaces, I try to push back as much as I can. And the best one was this person that was just like lying off at the side. And then like, if you know that I am pissed off in a meeting with somebody that's taking up too much space, this is what I look like. Right? So I think it's body language and all of that stuff. And if they're not going to get it, they're not going to get it. For me, for my safety and for my well-being, I usually then just remove myself from those places where I can be harmed. And is that fighting back against it? I don't know. But at some point in time, I can't fight back against somebody who doesn't see it, somebody who just continues to take up space.
And if I can add, and I'll try and be brief, particularly given what I'm talking about, but the kicker of all this too is that you're probably more likely as a junior faculty person in those spaces to get actually put in more and more spaces and get overworked as an Indigenous faculty member. And therefore, so it's not just that cut is deeper and more bloody for you than it might be for me. It's also that you're more likely to be put in with the person about whom, or the people, the white men about whom the question is talking. So I think it's like this double piece here. It's this double whammy of injury that comes in that. And I think there's a place for like the demanding of the sort of, is there a moderate you can say, hey, can you call this out? Because I'm done. I gotta not be injured any longer today. And that's already that tracking of that goes back to Fanon, it goes back to Marx. The idea of injury, spirit injury, all that stuff gets tracked deep in anti-colonial work. And that's what it means to pay attention, to go to your thing. It just is pulling back resistance. Yeah, because you're not in the room for them to say, hey, we're doing it. Yeah. You know, this scholar's here, she's okay. And, you know, so I think what you said is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I do that. I will email whoever it is to say, look, I'm not coming back. I don't feel safe in this place. And I believe there's an imbalance of power that's happening, and I can't continue to push back against it. So be well.
Thank you for that. The next question comes from Terry. I wonder about moving decolonization into systemic and institutional spaces and crucial aspects of that transformative learning, unlearning, and relearning. So I'll let either of you respond to that.
Oh, and what is it that you wonder? I feel like it's not a whole question. I wonder how to do that. How to...
Terry, do you want to add a bit more?
It looks cut off, actually.
Yes. Oh. Okay, let's maybe move on to the next one. This is from Mari Jane. I'm wondering about how colonial structures, issues of power and privilege impact the relationship or lack of relationship between teachers engaged in deep inquiry in their classrooms and formal scholarly work happening in institutions, especially as this pertains to the work of school advisors who work directly with teacher candidates.
At some moments, I think I understand it, but then I don't necessarily. Wondering about the colonial structures, like the issues of power. So the issues of power and privilege, and this is what I talk about when we're trying to take care of. And I think that, Arlo, that you spoke to this of having Indigenous teacher candidates in our spaces and making sure that we're creating the connections to the faculty associate and the school associate so that they're in a community of care and understanding, so that when, not if, when the racism happens for Indigenous student teachers in these spaces, that they have this surrounded care. Because if our school associate and our faculty associate don't know how to deal with or even acknowledge the racism and the microaggressions that happen for our student teachers, then we're not setting them up for success. So this whole imbalance of power then goes, well, I just have to survive this in order to get that certificate with my name on it. And I've been in a lot of spaces where I've just had to survive to get to the other end. And I don't think that's okay. I don't think that we should be surviving our education. We should be holding our educators accountable for what's happening within this. And I think there's a huge disconnect between when we're talking about it in a research frame of mind and what's happening in the classroom, what's happening within the classroom and how we can change that. And Shannon, I don't know if I'm saying it properly. You're nodding, so I'm thinking that I'm getting that connection across.
I think you are, and I think you're absolutely right. We need teacher educators to believe their teacher candidates when they report incidences of microaggressions. We need to honor those feelings, and I think you did make that clear, and I appreciate, again, the backup, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
We can also think about the link, right? If we think about what's the thread that goes from scholarship to like that ascends from the bottom, which might be scholarship. Now, let's start with theory at the bottom and ascends to the concrete in the classroom, and it goes through an associate teacher, or it goes through what's the wording? Oh, the chat moved on me. The advisor teacher. So what we call the advisor. So the person who goes out and talks to the teacher candidate. So we got this line from scholarship to someone who's helping out a teacher candidate and going out and working with them to an actual in-service teacher who may be really engaged in inquiry, presumably critical inquiry. I think that was what was intended in the question. Maybe I'm wrong, but so that idea, like, is there a long connection? And I can say, without attention, an anti-colonial sort of push without attention to anti-racism. I don't know that we can know what it'll exactly look like when it starts to transform, although maybe, Carolyn, your work is going to show us some of these pieces. But we do know if we don't pay, it goes back to Benen's idea around intention. If we're not making sure, for example, talking to advisors, like how will your interaction be an anti-racist one when you go out into that school today? If that conversation isn't happening, and if the check-in isn't happening around race, like for example, what are the questions you ask when you go visit someone in schools? I'll be honest, it's been a number of years since I've done that. But when I was doing it, I didn't go out and say, what's the race vibe here? Like, as maybe visiting a white person, how's white supremacy feeling here today? And why did I not say that? Because I don't know how it works at Simon Fraser and UBC, but these things, they have a lot of different ways they work in different spaces. But if without a through line that addresses colonialism and racism, we do know what it'll look like. We do know that it'll continue to serve a particular agenda, and we do know that there will be some severing of the really amazing work that's happened by a lot of scholars, from that actually getting to the space to ascending to the concrete, ascending to the utility of classroom application. So I think we know what happens when that isn't there, and that's how we hear colonialism clearly there.
Thank you for that. Christine also wants to know, she is interested in, I don't know if that's the pronoun Christine is using, is interested in knowing how to decolonize classroom management. Woo-hoo. For example, when the rest of the school expects kids to sit crisscross applesauce.
Yeah.
I'm just laughing. Oh, sorry. Crisscross applesauce and the whole body is listening.
Yeah.
Are we just not giving a flip about people walking in and perceiving those chaos? So
Do you try asking that again? Here's what I have to say. You have to have a relationship with your students. That's what it is. It just comes, it's really, we have to be able to know our students. We have to know what they're able to be capable of and what they need in that moment. I used to have a student, because my music room was fairly large. I had 2 carpets, and on one carpet, he would be on that carpet and he'd fling his body like around in a circle. He was trying to do some like kind of break dancing or whatever, but that was his way of concentration. And the rest of us were safe enough away that we weren't going to get hit by him. But that was his way of participating. We had a conversation as a class saying that this is what his body needs this in order to be able to pay attention and do this work. So we need to give him that space to do that, right? So, and if I hadn't given him that space to do that, can you imagine if I asked him to sit crisscross applesauce with the rest of us and sit and listen? So classroom management to me is the students are telling you something, so listen to them. They're shouting, look at me, look at me, look at me. What do they need? And it's your job to be able to respond to that. And people walking in and seeing your classroom as chaos, I love that when I used to watch you, because then everybody's deeply in whatever it is they're doing. So it's about relationships, my friends. Always is.
I would also push back on even the idea of classroom management. And I mean, for me, I'll defer to folks who want to talk about something being decolonized, but I'm really wary of the term in the sense that I'm comfortable talking about anti-colonialism and pushing back, but to have a place where people are free to move their bodies, and I don't know that to me, if it was my classroom, I wouldn't say this is a decolonized space now. And when we're talking about classroom management, I think to decolonize classroom management is actually a conversation that doesn't even involve kids. It's before you even get there. It's this idea of why are we managing that space in that way? It's basically trying to create order on the factory floor a little bit there. And why do these bodies need to be controlled? And then we could feed into, we could do a bunch of stuff, a bunch of analysis of like which bodies do I consider, why do I have my eye on that one body and I keep giving this person a hard time? You could do like a pattern analysis of why does someone's facial expression piss me off but somebody else's facial expression doesn't, even though they've actually said exactly the same thing? Why does someone holding their body that way anger me, but someone holding their body that way doesn't anger me? We could do all those things. Those are all good things. But fundamentally, the need to control, the setup of control, the brutality of school space is, think of an assembly. Think of sitting on a hard stone floor for 2 hours. I'm sorry. I mentioned my age once already. I don't ever want to do that again. I don't even like standing for 2 hours on a stone floor. So there's a cruelty to it, and the idea that we have to manage the classroom. I mean, that I think we're borrowing from not only just a human capital model there, but from a factory model. And I think. So even that, I think, and I know that sounds pie in the sky and somebody hasn't been in a classroom in a long time. I understand how ridiculous some of this may sound, but I think we have to ask those questions about, why is that even a question? Because we've got 35, 40, 50 people in some of these classrooms. There's a lot of questions about secondary popping up in the chat. The school near me has 50 kids in a number of their classes right now. Yeah, do bodies matter at that point? They sure do. Because the technology is set up in such a way that we're there to control bodies, and that's a colonial impulse, it's an imperial impulse, it's a capitalist impulse. And so put it this way, the kids they're better than that. They don't deserve being involved in the solution to classroom management. We should solve it before we even set eyes on them, in my mind.
Thank you so much. I know that we are 1 minute over time, but Janice has asked such a good question, so I want to throw it out to you. Maybe you can answer in 5 words or fewer. I can take your time, and then we'll wrap up for the afternoon or the evening. So she's asked if it's not possible to commit to creating safe spaces in the university for all of our students, and we recognize the need to build community and relationships as part of our work. How do we define these spaces?
I wasn't the one that said that. I believe it's absolutely possible to commit to being able to create safe spaces. I had a student this is more than 5 words. I had a student this past semester who cried on the last day of class. She just looked at me. She goes, I have never been able to be my true self in any other classroom but this classroom. So we have the ability to do it. It's the doing it that matters.
Yeah, I can't do 5 words either, as you may have guessed, but I would say that to me, I think the university, when I hear universities talk about we're indigenizing or we're decolonizing, I don't know. I think that's square peg, round hole. I think it's such a colonial structure. It's such a colonial undertaking. It's such a colonial operation. And I think we get back to spaces of, at least for a lot of students I know, surviving university is the verb they're talking about. And I know that a lot of the spaces that I'm part of co-facilitating are safer than a lot of the other spaces. But I guess what I mean in the sense of I'm no longer interested in a guarantee and offering that to students. And my commitment isn't to say it's not there and we won't have it ever, but that, I know from having been in so many spaces where the very things that gets said by colleagues in spaces, and this could be a teacher ed class where everybody's had exactly 4 years of schooling, or this could be a PhD seminar course where there's 12 people in the room, that someone's true, tearful, real thing that they want to share is absolutely dehumanizing for the person sitting next to them. And whether I chastise, or whether I invite, whether I call in, whether I call out, that dehumanization has taken place. And that is a lack of safety that's occurred. So to get to the idea of like, how do we talk about it? I think we talk about it like everything else as our commitments to it. What am I going to do? I'm going to look at, Sandra Stiers and I have written about this and looking at sort of, what does it mean to try and act in right relation? I'm going to work really hard to be in right relation and in the humility of knowing. And also at the same time, recognize that I've got some responsibility, that I have to call out certain things and call in certain things. So I'm not suggesting that it's not the right direction. I'm just thinking that I can no longer promise that destination. I can speak to the politics of the journey, and it's not uncomplicated. It's not uncomplicated, but it just, as I say, I've seen by the 20th time someone gets misgendered in a classroom, I'm going to say, well, I really appreciate your patience, trans student X, but can I tell you you were safe? Or we go fully online and no one talks to anyone else. Let's do it all in writing. Okay, the writing is going to contain those microaggressions. The writing is going to do that little bit of violence that's a quiet little dance that only a couple people pick up on, but really hurts. So, unless we're one-on-one. So that is the sort of messy, painful nature of it. And a thing that's designed for, by, and in service of colonial white reproduction, it has a momentum, it has a body, it has a way it moves, it's an ox crashing through a space. And I think we can do delicate dances in those spaces. And I'm just speaking of my own experiences, but I mean, regardless of the setups, to invite people to be honest because the honesty of people in spaces is brutal. The honesty is a violence at times. Someone's true understanding of a concept, reading anti-Black racism, someone reading Michael Dumas and putting it in conversation with their own experiences can be an experience of violence. And so to me, to say, yeah, I'm inviting you to that is to say, I definitely can't guarantee you're going to be okay. I don't feel good about that, but that's where
you can put measures in place.
Yeah.
For it to happen, right? And that's what I'm speaking of. Because
Sure.
I got to be real. I survived education, and I'm surviving my PhD barely. So I think that there's a lot of harm that happens in our classrooms still, and especially in our PhD classrooms. So yeah.
I would offer thriving if I knew you better, but as well as it could be both.
That was a fun note to end on. Thank you, both of you, for your thoughtful and brilliant responses, and for the time that you spent with us. And thanks to those who have asked such worthy questions. My apologies. People are texting me because they think I'm done now. I think there was someone from our team who wanted to get in a little request, but I just want to thank everyone who's participated today and wish you all an excellent and relaxing weekend.